February 8, 2017. A Wednesday that began like thousands of others in Reagan Tokes' 21 years of life. The Ohio State University senior woke in her off-campus apartment, probably checking her phone for messages, scrolling through social media, preparing for another day in what should have been the final semester of her undergraduate journey. She had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours, her name would become synonymous with a failure of the justice system, so profound that it would eventually change Ohio law. She couldn't foresee that her final Instagram post, a simple photo from her psychology class, would become a digital memorial viewed by thousands. Most tragically, she had no idea that a convicted felon named Brian Golsby, who should have been behind bars, was instead walking free due to a GPS monitoring system, as flawed as tissue paper in the rain. The dramatic irony is suffocating. While Reagan attended her classes, studied for exams, and made plans for her future, the man who would end her life was already circling closer, enabled by a criminal justice system that had failed at every crucial juncture. Reagan Leigh Tokes was the kind of young woman who made her hometown of Maumee, Ohio, proud. Born on January 25, 1996, she grew up in a close-knit family that valued education, hard work, and community service. Her parents, Lisa and Toby Tokes, watched their daughter blossom into exactly the kind of person any parent would hope to raise. Ambitious, compassionate, and determined to make a difference in the world. At Anthony Wayne High School, Reagan wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a standout student who managed to balance academic excellence with genuine kindness, a combination that's rarer than most people realize. Her classmates would later remember her infectious laugh, her willingness to help struggling students, and her unwavering optimism about the future. The foreshadowing was there, though no one could have recognized it at the time. Akin's passion for psychology and her dream of working in mental health stemmed from a deep desire to help people who were struggling, people who had made mistakes, people who needed second chances. She believed in rehabilitation over punishment, in the possibility of redemption, in the fundamental goodness of human nature. It's a cruel irony that these very qualities, her empathy, her belief in second chances, her trust in systems designed to protect society, would ultimately contribute to the circumstances that led to her death. By 2017, Reagan was in her final semester at Ohio State, majoring in psychology with plans to pursue graduate studies. She worked part-time at a local restaurant, saved money for her future, and maintained the kind of GPA that made her professors take notice. She was by every measure exactly where a 21-year-old should be, on the cusp of adulthood, full of dreams, surrounded by friends, and loved by family. But there was something else happening in Ohio in early 2017, something Reagan knew nothing about. The state's electronic monitoring system, the technology meant to keep dangerous criminals under surveillance while they served house arrest sentences, was failing with alarming regularity. Budget cuts had led to understaffing. Equipment was outdated. Protocols were inconsistently followed. And Brian Lee Golsby, a man with a history of violence against women, was about to slip through every crack in the system. To understand the full scope of the tragedy that befell Reagan Tokes, we must first understand Brian Lee Golsby, not to humanize him or excuse his actions, but to comprehend how the system failed so catastrophically that he was free to kill. Golsby's criminal history reads like a textbook case of escalating violence. Born in 1988, he began accumulating charges in his teens: theft, burglary, assault. But it was his pattern of violence against women that should have served as a red flag visible from space. In 2011, Golsby was convicted of abduction and rape. The details of that case bear an eerie similarity to what would happen to Reagan 6 years later. He had approached a young woman, forced her into a vehicle, driven her to a secluded location, and sexually assaulted her. The victim in that case survived to testify, to see justice served, to watch Golsby sentenced to 6 years in prison. 6 years. For abduction and rape. Here's where the dramatic irony becomes almost unbearable. While Reagan Tokes was in high school, learning about criminal justice reform and developing her passion for rehabilitation, Brian Golsby was serving a sentence that criminal justice experts now widely acknowledge was inadequate for his crimes. In March 2016, after serving just 5 years of his 6-year sentence, Golsby was released on electronic monitoring. He was supposed to remain at a halfway house, supposed to check in regularly with his parole officer, supposed to wear a GPS ankle monitor that would alert authorities if he strayed from approved locations. But supposed to and actually did are two very different things, and the gap between them would prove fatal. From the moment of his release, Golsby began testing the boundaries of his electronic monitoring. He would leave his assigned residence without permission, venture into areas where he was prohibited from going, and consistently fail to maintain contact with his supervising officers. Each violation should have been a warning sign. Each failure to follow the rules should have resulted in immediate consequences. Instead, the violations were logged, filed, and largely ignored. The GPS monitoring system, meanwhile, was revealing its own fatal flaw. The device Golsby wore was outdated technology, prone to signal loss in areas with poor cell coverage. When the signal was lost, no immediate alert was sent to authorities. Instead, the system would simply note the gap in coverage and move on. Even more disturbing, when violations were detected, the response was sluggish at best. Parole officers were overloaded with cases, working with outdated equipment and insufficient resources. A violation detected on Monday might not be investigated until Wednesday, if at all. By February 2017, Golsby had accumulated dozens of violations. He had been found in possession of drugs, had failed multiple drug tests, had repeatedly left his assigned residence without permission, and had been caught in areas where sex offenders were prohibited from going. Each violation was documented. Each failure was noted in his file. And each time the system found a way to give him another chance. The tragic irony is that while Reagan Tokes was in her psychology classes, learning about the importance of rehabilitation and second chances, the very system she believed in was giving Brian Golsby chances that he would use to hunt his next victim. February 8, 2017, began as an ordinary day for Reagan Tokes, but the threads of tragedy had been weaving together for months. Reagan's Wednesday started with her usual routine. She attended her psychology classes at Ohio State, took careful notes about human behavior and criminal rehabilitation, and posted a photo on Instagram showing her dedication to her studies. The image, Reagan sitting in her lecture hall, textbooks open, looking every inch the serious student, would later be viewed by hundreds of thousands of people as they learned her story. After classes, Reagan went to work at her part-time job at Bodega, a popular restaurant near campus. She was scheduled to close that night, which meant she wouldn't get off work until nearly midnight. It was a typical arrangement for a college student trying to balance academics and income, the kind of schedule that millions of young people maintain without incident. But February 8, 2017 was not going to be typical. Earlier that same day, Brian Golsby's GPS monitor had lost signal. Again. This time, instead of remaining at his assigned location or immediately contacting his parole officer as required, Golsby saw an opportunity. He had been planning something, exactly what, we may never fully know, but the signal failure gave him the window he needed. The dramatic irony is staggering. While Reagan was in class learning about criminal behavior and rehabilitation, the very criminal who would end her life was preparing to strike, enabled by the system's failure. Golsby drove to the short north area of Columbus, the trendy district where Reagan worked. It wasn't his first time in the area, despite being prohibited from being there due to his sex offender status. He had been spotted in the neighborhood multiple times in the weeks leading up to February 8th. Each sighting had been reported. Each violation had been documented. None had resulted in his return to prison. As Reagan's shift at Bodega wound down, she followed her typical closing routine. She cleaned tables, counted the register, and prepared to lock up for the night. Her manager had already left, trusting Reagan to handle the closing procedures, a responsibility that spoke to her maturity and reliability. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Reagan left Bodega and walked toward her car, which was parked in a nearby lot. Security cameras would later show her walking alone, keys in hand, looking like any of the thousands of young people who work late shifts in college towns across America. What the cameras also captured, in grainy footage that would later be enhanced and analyzed frame by frame, was Brian Golsby following her. The next hour of Reagan Tokes' life represents one of the most thoroughly documented, yet heart-wrenching crimes in recent Ohio history. Thanks to security cameras, cell phone records, GPS data, and witness testimony, investigators were able to reconstruct her final moments with devastating precision. At 11:32 p.m., Reagan reached her car, a red Honda Civic that had been a graduation gift from her parents. She was fumbling with her keys, probably thinking about the psychology paper she needed to finish or the plans she had made for the weekend with friends. Brian Golsby approached from behind. What happened next was captured partially by a nearby security camera, though the footage is too grainy to show details. What investigators determined, based on physical evidence and Golsby's later confession, was that he forced Reagan into her own vehicle at gunpoint. The dramatic irony is almost too painful to contemplate. Reagan, who had spent years studying criminal behavior and believing in the possibility of rehabilitation, found herself face to face with a criminal that the system had failed to rehabilitate, failed to monitor, and failed to contain. At 11:35 p.m., Reagan's red Honda Civic, now with Golsby behind the wheel, left the parking lot. Cell phone towers tracked their movement as Golsby drove east, toward rural areas outside Columbus. Reagan's phone remained active during this time, its signal providing a digital breadcrumb trail that investigators would later follow. The drive took approximately 20 minutes. During this time, 20 minutes that must have felt like 20 hours to Reagan, she was undoubtedly terrified, probably pleading for her life, possibly trying to understand why this was happening to her. Golsby drove to a remote area in Fairfield County, far from the city lights and the safety of populated areas. It was here, in the darkness beside a rural road, that he sexually assaulted Reagan Tokes. And then he shot her. Reagan Tokes died at approximately 12:15 a.m. on February 9, 2017, in a cornfield beside a country road. 21 years old, 3 months shy of graduation, surrounded by darkness and silence. The cruel irony is that at the exact moment Reagan was dying, Brian Golsby's GPS monitor was registering no signal. The system designed to track his whereabouts had no idea where he was. The technology meant to protect society from violent offenders had failed completely. Golsby left Reagan's body where she fell and drove her car back toward Columbus. He abandoned the Honda in a parking lot and disappeared into the night, believing he had committed the perfect crime. He was wrong. Dawn broke on February 9, 2017, with Reagan Tokes' parents believing their daughter was safe in her apartment, probably sleeping off a late night at work. They had no reason to worry. Reagan was responsible, reliable, and always checked in if her plans changed. But Reagan's phone had gone silent at 12:15 a.m. The first sign that something was wrong came when Reagan failed to show up for her Thursday morning class. Her professors knew her as a dedicated student who rarely missed class and always notified them in advance if she couldn't attend. When she didn't appear and didn't respond to texts or calls, her friends began to worry. By Thursday afternoon, Reagan's parents were the conversation that every parent dreads, "We can't find Reagan," sent Lisa and Toby Tokes into a panic that would only intensify over the next several hours. Reagan's red Honda Civic was found first, abandoned in a Columbus parking lot, miles from where she was last seen. The discovery of the car, without Reagan, triggered an immediate missing persons investigation, though everyone involved hoped against hope that there was an innocent explanation. On Friday, February 10th, a farmer checking his property in rural Fairfield County made the discovery that would shatter the Tokes family and outrage a community. Reagan's body was found beside a country road, 2 gunshot wounds ending a life that had held so much promise. The crime scene told a story that investigators wished they didn't have to read. Evidence of sexual assault, signs of a struggle, the brutal end to a young woman who had never hurt anyone, who had dedicated her studies to understanding and helping others, who had believed in the fundamental capacity for human redemption. Within hours of Reagan's body being discovered, the investigation shifted into high gear. Detectives began analyzing security camera footage, cell phone records, and any other evidence that might lead them to her killer. What they found was a trail of systematic failures that had enabled a preventable murder. The investigation into Reagan Tokes' murder revealed a law enforcement response that was both impressively thorough and heartbreakingly belated. Within 48 hours of discovering Reagan's body, investigators had assembled a timeline of her final hours that was accurate to the minute. Security camera footage from multiple locations showed Reagan leaving work alone, walking to her car, and then, chillingly, being approached by a figure that remained frustratingly unclear in the grainy nighttime footage. But technology that failed to protect Reagan in life would help secure justice in her death. Cell phone tower data revealed the path of Reagan's phone from downtown Columbus to rural Fairfield County, providing investigators with a precise route and timeline. GPS data from various sources began to paint a picture of the crime that was both comprehensive and damning, but it was Brian Golsby's own GPS monitor, the same device that had failed to prevent the crime, that ultimately led to his capture. When investigators analyzed the data from Golsby's electronic monitoring device, they discovered that his GPS signal had been lost at exactly the time Reagan was abducted. More damning still, when the signal resumed, it showed him in the exact area where Reagan's body was found. The dramatic irony is breathtaking. The system that had failed to keep Golsby contained ultimately provided the evidence needed to convict him. On February 11, 2017, just 2 days after Reagan's body was discovered, Brian Golsby was arrested at a Columbus area motel. The legislation, officially known as House Bill 1, represented the most comprehensive reform of Ohio's electronic monitoring system in decades. Reagan's law included several key provisions: enhanced technology. The law required the use of real-time GPS monitoring technology that would immediately alert authorities when an offender violated the terms of their release. Reduced caseloads. Parole officers' caseloads were reduced to allow for more effective supervision of high-risk offenders. Mandatory responses. The law established specific protocols for responding to violations, including mandatory jail time for repeated offenses. Improved communication. Different agencies within the criminal justice system were required to share information more effectively. Victim notification. The law established systems to notify victims when their attackers were released or when violations occurred. The passage of Reagan's law represented a victory for the Tokes family, but it also highlighted the tragic irony of Reagan's death. It took the murder of a young woman who believed in rehabilitation and second chances to reform a system that was supposed to make those second chances meaningful. Reagan's law wasn't just about technology and procedures. It was about accountability. For too long, the electronic monitoring system had operated without real oversight or consequences. Reagan's death changed that, forcing officials to acknowledge that public safety couldn't be sacrificed for convenience or cost savings. The law's impact was immediate. Within months of its implementation, Ohio saw a significant decrease in violations of electronic monitoring terms and an increase in successful completions of supervised release programs. More importantly, no one has been murdered by an offender on electronic monitoring in Ohio since Reagan's law took effect. Reagan's story didn't end with the passage of Ohio legislation. Her murder and the systemic failures it exposed resonated far beyond the borders of the Buckeye State, inspiring reforms in jurisdictions across the country. States began examining their own electronic monitoring systems, often discovering similar failures and vulnerabilities. Reagan's law became a model for reform efforts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Texas, and other states, grappling with the challenge of effectively monitoring offenders in the community. The technology industry also took note. Companies that manufacture electronic monitoring equipment began developing more sophisticated systems capable of real-time tracking and immediate violation alerts. Reagan's death, in essence, drove innovation in public safety technology. But perhaps the most significant impact of Reagan's story was on the families of other victims. Tokes' family's advocacy inspired other families to speak out about their experiences with system failures, creating a national conversation about the balance between rehabilitation and public safety. Reagan's story also influenced the academic field she had planned to enter. Criminal justice programs across the country began incorporating her case into their curricula, using it to illustrate the real-world consequences of policy, decisions, and system failures. The irony is profound. Who had planned to spend her career helping to rehabilitate offenders and improve the criminal justice system, ultimately achieved those goals through her death in ways she never could have accomplished in life. Today, more than 5 years after her death, Reagan Tokes is remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. Her name appears on legislation. Her story is told in criminal justice classrooms, and her memory continues to inspire reforms designed to protect public safety. But those who knew Reagan best remember her for who she was, not how she died. At Ohio State University, a scholarship has been established in Reagan's name, providing financial assistance to psychology students who share her passion for helping others. The scholarship recipients are chosen not just for their academic achievements, but for their commitment to making a positive difference in the world, just as Reagan planned to do. Her hometown of Maumee has established a memorial garden in Reagan's honor, a peaceful space where visitors can reflect on the importance of public safety and the value of individual lives. The garden includes a plaque with one of Reagan's favorite quotes: "Be the change you wish to see in the world." The dramatic irony continues even in memory. Reagan never had the chance to complete her degree or pursue her career in psychology, has probably done more to improve the criminal justice system than many professionals who spend decades in the field. At Anthony Wayne High School, Reagan's story is shared with students not to frighten them, but to inspire them to get involved in their communities and advocate for change. Her former teachers describe her as a student who genuinely cared about making the world better, a quality that her death ultimately amplified rather than silenced. The Tokes family continues their advocacy work, speaking at conferences, meeting with legislators, and working with other families who have experienced similar tragedy. They've turned their grief into a force for change, ensuring that Reagan's death serves a purpose beyond the senseless taking of a young life. Reagan Tokes' murder raises questions that extend far beyond the failures of Ohio's electronic monitoring system. Her death forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the balance between punishment and rehabilitation, between public safety and second chances, between the ideals of our justice system and its practical realities. Reagan believed in rehabilitation. She believed that people could change, that the criminal justice system could help offenders become productive members of society, that treatment was more effective than punishment alone. Brian Golsby proved her wrong, at least in his case. But does that mean Reagan's beliefs were naive? Does one monster's inability to change negate the possibility that others can be rehabilitated? These are the questions that criminal justice professionals, policymakers, and citizens continue to grapple with in the aftermath of Reagan's death. Her murder doesn't provide easy answers to these complex questions, but it does underscore the importance of asking them. What Reagan's story does provide is a clear example of what happens when systems fail, when oversight is inadequate, when warning signs are ignored. It shows that the cost of those failures isn't measured in budget dollars or administrative efficiency. It's measured in human life. The most devastating irony of Reagan Tokes' story is that she died because of the very system she had faith in. She believed in second chances, in rehabilitation, in the possibility of redemption. The system that was supposed to embody those values instead enabled her murder. But perhaps there's another way to view that irony. Reagan's death led to reforms that have made the system more effective, more accountable, more worthy of the faith she placed in it. In death, she achieved what she had hoped to accomplish in life. She made the criminal justice system better. Brian Golsby remains on death row in Ohio, his appeals moving slowly through the courts. He has shown no remorse for his actions, no recognition of the life he stole, no acknowledgement of the pain he caused. Reagan Tokes, meanwhile, remains present in the laws that bear her name, the reforms her death inspired, and the lives that have been saved because of the changes her family fought to implement. In the end, that may be Reagan's greatest victory. That a life devoted to helping others continues to help others, even after that life was stolen by someone who couldn't be helped. The foreshadowing was always there, written in the gaps between what our justice system promises and what it delivers. Reagan Tokes simply had the misfortune to fall through one of those gaps. But her fall illuminated the darkness, and in that light, others have found the path to safety. Her story reminds us that behind every policy failure, every budget cut, every administrative shortcut, there are real people whose lives hang in the balance. Reagan Tokes was one of those people, and her death demands that we do better. The question now is whether we will. In memory of Reagan Leigh Tokes, January 25, 1996, February 9, 2017, a life that mattered, a death that changed everything.